The initial selection from the Quick Selection tool is pretty good for a starter selection, but there are probably places along some of the edges where we can do a better job. Whenever I use the Quick Selection tool, I always think of it as part one of a two-step process. The second part involves further refinements using the Select and Mask workspace. The first thing that I need to do is bring back that selection, so I'll go to the Channels panel where I saved it, and I will hold down the Command key on Mac or the Control key on Windows, and I'll click on the thumbnail or the name of that alpha channel to reload it as a selection, and then I'll click on the tab for the Layers panel to go back to there. And let me zoom up using Command plus or Control plus on the keyboard to just see if there's anything obvious that I can fix. And this area here by his knees and his thighs where he's kneeling down on the board, I'll go get the Quick Selection tool, and let me tap the right bracket key to make my brush a little bit bigger, and I'm going to hold down the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows to subtract that area there. Now, if you can't remember the shortcut, there is a button for that up here in the Options bar for the Quick Selection tool. But I'm just going to hold down that modifier key, Option on Mac, Alt on Windows, to brush over those and fix that a little bit. I'm not going to worry about this too much because I have an idea that those parts might be covered up once we actually get him inside the bottle. And let's see what other things we might need to deal with. There's a few spots here along the edge of his fingers. Let me Option or Alt click there. And these little narrow gaps between his fingers, I'm just going to save those for the Select and Mask workspace. Come and look at his other hand here. And come down with a real small brush to come into there. Again, these are areas that might be better modified in the Select and Mask workspace. So I think that that's good for now. All right, so let's go into Select and Mask. There's a couple ways we can get in there. We can go to the Select menu and choose Select and Mask. Or whenever you have a selection tool active, you can just come to the Select and Mask button in the Options bar for that selection tool, and that's what I'll do there. So before we get in too deep here, let's just take a quick overview of what's going on in the Select and Mask workspace. It takes over your entire screen. And the appearance of the image when it initially appears here will be based on how you last used this dialog. So the last time I used it, I had the preview, the view mode here set to overlay, and that's why we see that. I'm going to start off with the onion skin mode. So this just has the area that is not selected represented as being partially transparent, and you can modify the level of that transparency with this slider. For some projects, that might be the way you want to work. Marching ants is really not useful at all. We'll skip over that. Overlay is like a quick mask overlay where the non-selected areas are represented with a transparent red overlay. And you can change the color of that overlay here with this color swatch. And you can also change what the color indicates. In this case, it's indicating the masked areas, the areas that were not selected. By the way, each of these view modes has a single letter keyboard shortcut. It's highly useful to memorize the ones that you use the most often because it makes it much faster to switch between them. So on black, we'll display it on black, and you have an opacity slider to adjust that. Very useful to get a sense of how something might look if you're going to composite it on a much darker background, or in the case of white, a much lighter background. I personally like the black and white view quite a lot because it really shows me the edges in a very detailed way, and I can see how the modifications that I'm making are affecting the edges. Plus, this looks like a traditional Photoshop mask, so it's a visual way of regarding the selection that I'm very familiar with. And then finally, we have the On Layers view, which allows us to see the image composited with any layers that are underneath it. This is also obviously a very useful view. Next, we have the edge detection section, and this is where you can specify what the radius is that Photoshop should use when it's looking at the edges and seeing if it can do a better job. There's also a Smart Radius checkbox, which is useful if you have subjects where there is a blend of both hard, precise edges and more indistinct fuzzy edges in the same object. It'll do a better job of creating a selection edge when that is enabled. Now, to see the radius, there is a Show Edge checkbox up here, but that is grayed out unless you have the Refine Edge brush active over here in the tool panel. So I'll click that, and now I can actually show the edge, and you can see how the radius slider is affecting the edge. So this is the edge where I'm telling Photoshop, go have a look at this edge and see if you can do a better job creating precise edge for that selection. I'm going to turn that off there. We'll talk about the global refinements a little bit later, as well as the output settings. Back over here to the tools in the upper left, we have a quick selection tool, the Refine Edge brush tool, which we'll use here in a second, a regular brush tool, just like you might normally paint on a mask to modify it, and a couple of lasso tools. I'll set that back to the Refine Edge brush tool. And let me zoom up here. We'll get the zoom tool and zoom up on his left hand and get the Refine Edge brush tool and just paint over that area. And you can see how that is bringing back in the background behind him. It's like actually refining the edge of the mask as it's supposed to and hiding that edge. So that looks pretty good. Let's come over to this part of his hand here and see what that looks like. So there's still some edge problems here, but we're going to deal with that in another way. Let's switch to the black and white mode so we can discuss some options here. So anytime you see gray in the mask, that means something that's partially selected. You can address that sometimes with the contrast slider. So if I increase the contrast of the mask, those gray areas in the mask are lightened and turned to white. Now the downside to that is if you go too far, you're going to introduce harder, more abrupt, jagged edges. So it's always a fine line to find the balance between what is a good contrast setting and what's too much. The smooth setting will just smooth the edges of the mask. In this case, I don't really want to do that, or if I did, it would certainly be by no more than about 1 pixel. Feather will just feather or soften the edges of the mask. And obviously, if you want a precise edge mask, you don't want to do that. And then Shift Edge is useful because it will expand or contract the edges of the mask. Let's set this back to the On Layers view and see if we can use Shift Edge to fix the edges of the hands there. So here's where Shift Edge gets tricky. It's working somewhat, but it's also having an adverse effect on other parts of the image. So along his head up here, it's not doing a good job, and along the fingers there, it's not doing a good job. So I think that's something that I'm going to address in another way a little bit later. So I'll set that back to its starting point there. Set that back to 0. And that actually brings up a really good point, and that is you should not obsess too much about getting the mask 100% perfect at this point. Wait until the layer is composited in more or less the final place where it will be, just so you can see how it looks then. Because sometimes you might not really notice the small errors or irregularities that you see in the Select and Mask workspace. And rather than spend hours and hours at this early stage, the aim here is to get a good working mask so we can just see what the composite looks like and see what it needs. And then you can wait until a little bit later to get really obsessive about the mask. Okay, that looks more or less okay at the moment. I'm going to come down here to the output settings. I'm not going to use decontaminate colors right now. Sometimes that is useful if you have selections of areas that have kind of indistinct or fuzzy, wispy edges like mist or clouds or hair. And it helps to remove the color from the original background pixels that are around the object that you're selecting. But in this case, I'm just going to choose Layer Mask and choose OK. And you can see here it's added that layer mask. If I hold down the Shift key, I can turn that layer mask off. And you can see that all of the image data on that layer is still there. It has not been deleted. It's just masked or hidden. And in most cases, a layer mask is really my preferred method for removing background from around a subject in a composite, because if I make any mistakes, I can easily go back and just edit the mask. Whereas if I'm actually erasing and deleting pixels, I can't do that. And it's much harder to fix, especially if it's a more significant error. So the quick selection tool combined with the Select and Mask workspace is a great way to make selections where there's a distinct tonal or color difference between what you want to select and the rest of the image.